Ella Grant dragged the first tobacco rack away from the wall of the closed herb barn, even though everyone else saw it as scrap. Rain streaked the windows behind her. Across the yard, the farm shop had been dark for months, its shelves emptied after too many batches of herbs spoiled before they could be sold. Ella had been home less than a week when a small tea shop called asking whether the farm could fill one modest summer order. She said yes before Ray could say no. Her father stood in the doorway, staring at the tall wooden racks Ella had pulled into rows. Those things haven't cured tobacco in 20 years. They don't need to cure tobacco. May, Ella's younger sister, lifted one dusty crossbar and let it drop. So what are they now? Ella looked through the repeating frames toward the two old circulation fans mounted near the far wall. Maybe the reason we don't have to close for good. May laughed once, not cruelly, but without believing her. Ray didn't. He checked one of the rack uprights with both hands. The wood was still sound. Ella had spent 2 days removing anything that could not be cleaned safely and scrubbing the rest. But Ray was not looking at cleanliness. He was looking at value. A used equipment dealer was coming after the harvest cycle. The fans, work tables, racks, scales, and whatever else could be sold would help cover what remained from the failed season. Ray had stopped pretending the herb business was merely paused. You had a layoff, he told Ella. You don't have to turn that into another gamble. Ella kept threading a clean hanging bar through the rack. Her last job had been organizing production flow for a regional packing company. She had spent years watching hours disappear because materials arrived in the wrong sequence, workstations clogged, or people tried to force more product through a system than it could handle. Then the company cut her position. She came home with severance money and no plan to stay. The barn changed that. The farm had not failed because people stopped buying herbs. Buyers had complained that deliveries were inconsistent. Some bundles were overdried and brittle. Others held too much moisture and spoiled in storage. Ray had tried smaller harvests. May had tried turning the herbs by hand. Neither fixed the central problem. Humid summer weather slowed everything, and the barn never dried one load evenly enough to trust. Ella stopped beside a rack holding the first fresh-cut bundles of the new season. The order she had accepted was small enough to fit on only part of one wall. That was deliberate. She had called the buyer, Tori, that morning. I'm not promising the old volume, Ella had told her. Give me one order. One that passes, Tori replied. One that passes. If it failed, Tori owed them nothing. If it worked, Ella would have proof that mattered more than family optimism. Ray stood beside the electrical panel while a licensed electrician finished the protected connection Ella had paid for from her severance. Meters, wiring work, cleaning supplies, replacement belts, none of it was enough to ruin her. But it was enough that walking away would hurt. Ray noticed the receipt folded in her notebook. You spent your own money. Ella nodded. That doesn't make this barn yours. I know. And one order doesn't reopen the shop. I know that too. He studied her for a moment. One harvest cycle. May turned toward him. Dad. One? Ray repeated. She can use the barn and the equipment until then. After that, if this doesn't work, I call the auction man. Ella set the notebook on the work table. Deal. That afternoon, she and May loaded only a narrow section of the racks. Ella measured the gaps between bundles instead of hanging them wherever space remained. May watched her leave empty bars. You know we have more herbs cut. I know. Then why leave half the rack empty? Because I don't know what the air's doing yet. Ella switched on the first fan. Dust shifted along the cleaned floor. Leaves stirred at the front of the rack. Farther back, almost nothing moved. Ella walked slowly down the row, holding a light strip of tissue near different openings. At the first rack, it fluttered hard. At the second, less. Near the middle, it barely lifted. She turned toward the tall, repeating frames stretching into the dim barn. The old racks were not the useless part. The air was, and if Ella could not make 2 fans carry drying air through those racks evenly, the small tea order she had already accepted would become the first failure of the farm's final harvest cycle. The next morning, Ella closed the barn doors halfway and stood in the center aisle with her notebook. She was not testing whether the fans worked. They worked. The problem was where their air went after leaving the blades. At the front of the rack wall, the herb leaves trembled constantly. Farther back, some bundles barely moved at all. Ella marked each rack position and checked the same points again. Fast, moderate, weak, almost still. May leaned against a work table. So the fans are too small. Maybe That sounds like yes. Ella shook her head. It sounds like I don't know yet. Replacing equipment would be expensive. Adding more fans would increase power demand, and Ray had already made it clear there would be no major investment in a barn scheduled for auction. Ella had 2 usable fans. Whatever solution existed had to begin there. She watched the nearest bundles bending under direct airflow. The air was hitting one section hard, then escaping through the easiest open paths. It was not being forced through the crop evenly. She moved several bundles farther apart. The air simply found a different path. By noon, Ella had moved racks, changed spacing, and tested narrow loads against wider ones. Nothing solved the basic imbalance. May brought her a sandwich. You've been moving the same plants for 4 hours. I've been changing one thing at a time. Looks like moving plants. Ella smiled. That too. Ray came in after lunch. How long before you know whether the order's safe? Ella looked at the calendar clipped above the table. The herbs already hanging in the barn could not wait indefinitely while she experimented. Drying began the moment the crop was cut. Every extra humid hour mattered. I need this first load to tell me something by tomorrow. And if it doesn't, then I change the setup. And the order. I still fill it. Ray did not answer. Ella understood the look. He had heard promises like that before. Not from her, but from the business itself. One more crop. One more buyer. One more adjustment. Then another rejected batch. By late afternoon, Ella stopped trying to make the entire barn behave like one open room. She built a temporary wall of clean panels beside the first fan, leaving a controlled passage that directed moving air toward one section of racks. May watched. You're blocking the fan. I'm blocking where the air can escape. That seems backward. It probably will until it works. Ella started the fan. The nearest bundles lifted sharply. She moved deeper with the tissue strip. Second rack strong. Third still moving. Fourth weaker, but not still. For the first time, the airflow reached farther into the crop. She switched on the second fan from the opposite side. The 2 streams met unevenly. One side pushed harder. The center swirled. Several hanging bundles twisted on their bars. Ella shut one fan off. The idea was right. The arrangement was wrong. She changed the panels again, using narrower openings so neither fan blasted directly into the racks. Instead of 2 strong streams colliding, she spread each one before it reached the herbs. The effect was gentler, less dramatic. That worried May. They barely move now. They don't need to flap. How do you know? I don't yet. That evening, Ella loaded one controlled rack wall more heavily than the earlier test, but left measured gaps between bundles. Not full, not empty. Enough crop to make the result useful. She placed marked samples at the front, middle, and rear. Ray returned before dark. You leaving those fans on? On the safe circuit, the electrician checked. All night. Low speed? Ray nodded toward the herbs. You're trusting that? No. Ella held up the notebook. I'm measuring it. By the following morning, the difference was visible. The outer leaves on the rack nearest the fan had begun to tighten. Ella checked them by touch. Drier than she wanted. She moved immediately to the center bundles. They felt cooler. Heavier. The marked samples confirmed it. The outside was drying fast. The center was lagging badly. May stood beside her. So it failed. Ella looked from the brittle-feeling edges to the damp center. Not exactly. How is that not failure? Because now I know what the fan wall is doing. Ella took down one bundle from the outer position. A few leaves crumbled at the tips. Then she opened a dense center bundle. Moisture still held deep inside it. Brittle outside, wet inside. Exactly the kind of inconsistency that had helped close the business. May stared at the 2 samples. That's what happened before. Yes. Then what did we prove? We proved air can reach the racks. Ella pointed at the damaged outer bundle. We're just delivering it wrong. Ray entered as she began removing half the hanging material. What are you doing? Making the load thinner. That means less capacity. For this test? And after the test, Ella did not answer immediately. Even if she could make a small rack dry evenly, the barn had far more rack space than 2 fans could serve at once. The old tobacco frames made the building look enormous. Useful, ready, but empty space was not the same thing as working capacity. Ella picked up one of the clean temporary panels. Instead of aiming it toward the rack, she angled it across the airflow. May watched her. What does that do? Stops the first bundles from taking everything? She placed a second panel farther down. Then another. Not walls. Baffles. Each redirected part of the moving air instead of letting it race straight through the easiest opening. Ella restarted the fan at low speed. The nearest leaves moved less. The middle leaves moved more. At the center, the tissue strip finally lifted instead of hanging dead. Reaching the center was not enough. Now she had to find out whether the same gentle airflow could dry the outside and middle into the same usable range before the tea order was due. By the third morning, Ella had stopped thinking of the barn as one drying room. She saw lanes, pressure points, dead pockets. The first failed batch had made one thing obvious: stronger airflow was not the same as better drying. Ella removed the worst brittle material from the test load and set it aside as unsaleable. She did not hide it. Ray saw the tray before breakfast. That part's lost. Yes, that's an expensive lesson. At her old job, failed runs became reports and meetings. Here, failure smelled green and damp and sat visibly on a work table. May came in carrying another small harvest. Where do you want these? Not on the racks yet? They were cut this morning. I know, so they need drying. They need a place in the sequence. May set the basket down harder than necessary. You keep saying sequence like the herbs care. The herbs don't. Ella pointed toward the fan wall. The air does. She had spent most of the night studying her notes. The direct blast had dried exposed surfaces too fast. Dense bundles had protected moisture inside themselves. And when air found wide gaps, it rushed through those gaps instead of pushing through the crop. Ella made each bundle smaller and more uniform. Then she reduced the depth of herbs hanging across each active rack. May watched empty spaces appear. We're going backward. We're making the test readable. We have an order. We'll have nothing if we keep making bad batches faster. Ella repositioned the baffles so part of the flow entered the crop, then redirected farther down the rack line. The changes looked unimpressive. That was intentional. No leaves snapped in the air. No bundles swung. The fans hummed steadily while the herbs barely trembled. Ella checked the same marked samples at planned intervals. She resisted moving the baffles every time one reading looked slightly wrong. She wanted a pattern. By afternoon, the front samples were still drying faster, but the difference was smaller. Ella narrowed one opening near the fan, shifted another baffle, then left the system alone again. The following morning, the outer herbs were firm but not brittle. The center bundles had lost noticeably more moisture. May squeezed a marked bundle. This one actually feels close. Don't trust close. Ella checked the sample. Then another. Then the rear. The readings were moving toward one another. That mattered more than any single good number. Ray entered while she recorded them. Order due when? Soon enough that I need this test finished today. He looked at the partly empty rack wall. And if this is the only amount you can dry at once, then that's the amount I can dry at once. Ray raised an eyebrow. Ella heard herself say it and almost laughed. 3 days earlier, she would have called that wasted capacity. Now she was beginning to understand that a full rack producing rejected herbs had no capacity at all. By late afternoon, she took samples from the same front, middle, and rear positions. May stood beside her. Ray remained near the doorway. The readings were not identical. They did not need to be. They had all reached the same usable moisture range. For the first time since Ella returned, the barn had produced one controlled load without brittle outer herbs and damp centers. May looked at the notebook. That's good, right? Yes. You could sound happier. Ella smiled. It's good. Ray inspected the herbs himself. What changed? Thinner loads, more even spacing, less direct air, baffles that make the flow pass through more of the crop. So the old racks weren't the problem, not by themselves. And the fans, enough for this much. Ray noticed the phrase, this much. Ella nodded. She was not ready to claim more. They prepared the tea shop order using herbs from the successful run. The sale was modest. It would not rescue the farm. But Tori accepted the shipment. No complaint. No moisture problem. No rejection. 2 days later, Tori called Ella directly. I want to see another batch. The second controlled batch followed the same spacing and baffle arrangement. It finished evenly again. This time, Tori came to the farm. She walked through the closed shop first, then into the barn. Her eyes followed the tall tobacco racks disappearing into the building. You're drying on those old curing racks. Tori touched one of the clean crossbars. My supplier list is tight this year. I can use more herbs. A lot more than those 2 test batches. May looked at Ella immediately. Ray said nothing. Tori named a wholesale order large enough to make reopening the shop seem possible instead of sentimental. Ella looked toward the barn. Rows and rows of empty rack space surrounded the small section that had just proven itself. The mechanism worked. The herbs dried evenly. The buyer was standing there with demand. For the first time, all that unused space looked less like caution and more like lost opportunity. Tori needed an answer. Ella looked at the racks, then at the two fans. She knew exactly how much of the barn she had proven. She also knew how much she had not. Then she said yes. Tori did not accept Ella's yes as proof. She accepted it as a promise. Before leaving, she asked to see the next drying run from beginning to end. I don't need a tour. I need to know the first 2 batches weren't accidents. The next morning, Ella loaded the same tested section exactly as before. Same bundle thickness, same spacing, same baffle positions. May followed behind with the chart. You really want every gap the same, as close as we can keep it. What if we can fit another bundle? Then we don't. May left the bar empty. That change did not escape Ella. Neither did Ray's. He had stopped asking whether the racks were worthless. Now he asked when the readings would be ready. Tori arrived midway through the run. The weather had turned heavy and humid, with low clouds over the farm and almost no breeze outside. May glanced through the rain-darkened windows. Worst possible day to show a buyer? Ella looked toward the racks. Good. If it only works on easy days, it doesn't work. Tori heard that as she entered. That's what I came to find out. Ella showed her the one difference that mattered. The baffles prevented the fans from blasting exposed edges while sending almost nothing through the deeper crop. Then she took the marked samples. One from the front, one from the center, one from the rear. The first reading fell inside the acceptable range. So did the second, then the third. Tori stepped closer to the notebook. And this is the same setup as the last batch. Yes. Tori picked up one of the finished bundles. No crumbling edges, no cool, damp center. She set it down. Pack it. Tori inspected the finished order before it left the barn. Then she signed the acceptance sheet. Ray looked at the signed page longer than Ella did. For months, every document connected to the herb business had meant something leaving. A rejected invoice, a canceled order, an equipment list, a bill. This one meant product was moving out because somebody wanted more. Tori folded her copy. The wholesale offer stands. Ray finally asked the question nobody had said aloud. How much more? Tori named the volume. The number changed the room. The small tested section suddenly looked very small. Ella walked down the central aisle. The barn had been built to hold far more crop than she was currently using. Tall rack after tall rack stood empty. They had been cleaned. The frames were sound. The two fans had operated reliably. The baffle pattern had worked 3 times, and Tori was offering enough business to make reopening the shop financially realistic. Ray stepped beside Ella. You can say no. To the order. To all of it. He pointed around the barn. The small runs worked. That's more than we had before. We can sell some herbs locally and still auction the rest. May frowned. We finally have a wholesale buyer. Ray looked at Ella. I'm saying she doesn't owe this barn a miracle. Ella hated the word because she did not believe in one. Nothing she had done was miraculous. She had watched where the air moved, changed the load, redirected the flow, measured the result, then repeated it. That was exactly why the wholesale opportunity felt possible, not guaranteed. Possible. Ella opened her notebook and sketched the barn layout. We don't fill everything at once. She divided the rack rows into groups. We expand in stages. Tori looked over. How much can you guarantee? Ella studied the layout. I can guarantee the process we've proven. For the larger order, I need to load in sections and keep checking how the deeper racks respond. My delivery date doesn't move. I understand. And I need the full accepted weight we agreed on. That was the pressure. A staged expansion sounded cautious, but every stage still had to move quickly enough to meet one fixed delivery. By the next morning, Ella had extended the baffles beyond the original rack wall. The first expanded section behaved well. Front and center samples tracked closely enough to continue. The second section came online. Then another. Each successful check made the empty racks ahead harder to ignore. Harvested herbs arrived faster. Work tables filled. The deadline did not move. Ray helped transport clean hanging bars. May managed spacing from Ella's chart. For the first time, they were working like a business expecting to sell something. By evening, most active sections showed the same encouraging pattern. Ella stood at the end of the aisle. listening to the two fans. They sounded exactly as they had during the successful small runs. That reassured her. Maybe too much. May came beside her. We still have harvested bundles waiting. They could leave them crowded on staging tables and risk losing time before drying even began. Or they could use more rack capacity now. Ella looked toward the deep center of the barn. The tissue strip still moved there. Not strongly, but it moved. She checked one intermediate sample. It was behind the outer rack. Not alarmingly. Not yet. May waited. Do we stop? Ella looked at the herbs waiting to be hung. Then at Tori's delivery date circled in the notebook. No. She pointed to the next rows. Keep the spacing exact. Don't thicken the bundles. Nobody loads beyond the marked line until I check the center again. They worked into the evening. For the first time since the shop closed, the tall tobacco racks were filling with enough herbs to make the barn look alive again. Ray paused in the doorway. You were right about those racks. It was the reversal Ella might once have wanted. She barely had time to feel it. Because deep in the center of the expanding load, the air was already moving more slowly than it had that morning. By the following day, Ella's staged expansion had become a race between 3 clocks. The herbs were coming in from the field. Tori's delivery date was fixed, and the two fans had not become stronger just because the order had grown. The outer racks looked promising. The middle rows were slower, not failed. Slower? Ella checked the center position again. Still behind. May waited beside another cart. Well, we hold this cart for 20 minutes. We're already backed up. I know. And these are already cut. I know that too. Drying began after harvest, whether the barn was ready or not. Leaving fresh herbs waiting too long created its own risk. But adding more crop increased resistance inside a system already showing strain. There was no clean choice anymore. Only costs. 20 minutes later, the center reading improved. Not enough to match the edge. Enough that Ella released the next load. Same spacing, no shortcuts. They loaded another section. By midday, fresh-cut herbs filled nearly every active area Ella had marked. The old tobacco racks were holding the largest volume the farm had attempted since before the shop closed. Ella should have felt victorious. Instead, she kept walking to the center. The difference was widening. The outer racks continued drying predictably. The center racks did not stop. They simply fell farther behind. May saw her checking the same position again. That one's still slow. Yes? Can we move those bundles outward? Not without crowding another zone. What about opening the spacing? We'd have to unload half the section. Nothing looked broken. The baffles were positioned correctly. The bundles were not thicker than the approved size. No one had ignored her spacing chart. The system was not failing because someone had become careless. It was reaching a limit. Every added layer of crop slowed the same finite volume of moving air. The original test section had proven that 2 fans could dry a controlled load. It had never proven they could dry the barn at this depth. Ella made the most defensible choice she could. No more new sections. May looked toward the staging carts. What do we do with those? Sequence them behind what's already moving. That'll delay them. Yes. Will we still make the order? Ella looked toward the center racks. I'm trying to protect the order we already have on the wall. From that point forward, no more racks were activated. The barn was not completely full, but it was fuller than any tested configuration. At first, the differences looked manageable. Then Ray came in near dusk. Tori called. She asked whether pickup stays on schedule. What did you tell her? That you'd call. Ray watched her face. Does it? Ella looked at the chart. I need one more full check. That evening, the outside was good. The rear section was behind but progressing. Then she reached the center. The first sample was wetter than expected. She checked another. Same pattern. Can we turn the fans up? May asked. Ella shook her head. More speed would not magically solve distribution, and blasting the exposed racks harder risked recreating the brittle edge failure. So what now? We reduce resistance. They began moving selected bundles out of the deepest center positions, enough to open clearer air paths. It cost hours. It also gave the remaining load a chance. By morning, airflow improved. The center herbs were drying faster. Not caught up. Faster. Ella called Tori. We're still working the order. Still on the date. Tight. How tight? I may need to deliver in the latest part of the window. You know my blending schedule? I know. I can't hold production open indefinitely. You won't have to. After the call, May approached carefully. You think it'll make it? I think the adjustment helped? That wasn't my question. Ella closed the notebook. I don't know. The words hurt because the order had come from success. The baffles worked. The thinner loads worked. The measured spacing worked. The midpoint proof had been real. But Ella had mistaken a working method for unlimited capacity. Over the next 2 days, the barn divided itself into winners and laggards. The outer zones finished. Ella removed them as soon as they reached range, opening more airflow for rows behind. Some center racks followed. Others did not. Every finished batch created space, but the sequence had started too late to erase the congestion. Tori's pickup window approached. May and Ray packed only herbs that passed. Ella kept the lagging center material separate. No blending. No hiding wetter herbs inside accepted lots. The saleable weight grew. So did the shortfall. On the final morning, rain tapped the roof. Ella checked the last center group. She knew before seeing the reading. The herbs still felt cooler and heavier than the finished material beside them. Can we wait, May asked. Not enough. Can we send the good part? Tori needs the full accepted order. A faint stale smell had begun developing in part of the deepest load. Ella opened one bundle. The outer leaves looked almost ready. Inside, moisture had held too long. The same old contradiction had returned. Drier outside? Wet center. Only this time, it had happened after proof, after a buyer commitment, and across enough crop to threaten the business. Ella separated the affected herbs immediately. They would not go into Tori's shipment. May looked at the rejected pile growing on the clean table. We did everything on the chart. No. May frowned. We did. We followed the small system chart. Ella looked toward the long rack rows. I never built one for the full barn. Outside, the rain strengthened. Inside, the 2 fans kept running. And for the first time, Ella could hear exactly what they had been trying to tell her. They had never failed. She had simply asked the same amount of air to do more work than it could carry. Tori rejected the shipment before noon. Not all of the herbs were bad. That was almost harder. Boxes from the outer zones passed inspection. Several later cleared racks passed too. But the order had been contracted as one accepted volume, and Ella did not have enough saleable weight to meet it. Tori opened one bundle from the separated center lot. The outside looked dry. She pressed deeper. The inner stems were still soft. This can't go into storage. I know. I can take the passing portion under the original small account terms. I can't accept the wholesale order as fulfilled. Ella nodded. No argument. No request for Tori to overlook the shortfall. The rejected herbs remained on the farm. By afternoon, the clean work table held the physical cost of Ella's mistake bundles that had taken land, labor, harvest time, electricity, and days of drying but could no longer be sold through the order meant to save the business. May stood beside them. So that's it. Ray came in carrying a folder. Ella recognized the equipment list. The auction man can still come after this cycle, he said. May looked at him. Dad. He'll take the fans, tables, scales, racks that have resale value. We clear the barn and stop spending money trying to make it something it isn't. Ella stared at the list. It was a clean exit. No more rejected batches. No more severance money disappearing into a closed business. No more promises to buyers. Ray placed the folder on the table. You proved the racks can work. Nobody can take that from you. Ella looked at the rejected center herbs. But I proved the barn can fail too. That's why I'm giving you a way out. Ella walked to the drying chart. The mistake was visible there, not as one bad reading, as timing. Every new section had entered the system before the previous sections released enough airflow capacity. She had treated rack space as capacity. But the real capacity was how much crop 2 fans could move air through evenly at one time. More racks had never created more air. Ella picked up a pencil. I don't need a bigger barn. Ray sighed. Ella. I need a smaller system. May frowned. We already have the barn. I mean, smaller operating zones? Ella drew lines through the rack map. Instead of one connected drying wall spreading farther into the building, she divided the useful racks into shallow sections. Each zone would have a defined load, a defined airflow path, its own marked center and edge checks, and no new zone would be loaded simply because empty rack bars existed. What happens when one fills, May asked. We stop. And harvested herbs waiting outside. We don't harvest them until their drying slot is ready. That was the second change. The old workflow began with the field. Cut what was ready, bring it in, find space. Ella reversed it. The drying sequence would determine the harvest sequence. One zone loaded, one moving toward target. One cleared before the next heavy load entered. Staged harvest was no longer a way to keep workers organized. It became a limit. Ray tapped the chart. That means less at once. Yes, maybe less total. Maybe. And Tori wanted volume. She wanted accepted volume. That evening, Ella removed the long-shared assumptions from the old chart. She marked each shallow zone separately. May helped rehang the baffles so airflow entering one section could not simply disappear through a larger connected mass of crop. They did not add fans. They did not increase power. They reduced what each drying cell was responsible for. Then Ella made the hardest change. She cut the planned later harvest. Some herbs would remain in the field rather than being harvested into a drying bottleneck. May stared at the reduced list. We need the replacement weight. We need saleable weight. What if we don't have enough? Then we don't. Ella hated saying it, but she had finally stopped treating maximum volume as the goal. Dependable flow was the goal. Ray picked up the auction folder. You still have one chance under our agreement. I know. I can call this off now. No. Why? Ella glanced toward the rejected herbs. Because the first system taught me how to dry herbs. She tapped the new zone chart. That batch taught me how much not to ask it to do. The next morning, they loaded only the first shallow zone. No extra bundles. No just one more bar. May followed the chart without arguing. By afternoon, the center and edge were moving together. That was encouraging. It was not proof. Because outside, rain had settled over the farm. A humid stretch was moving in. Day after day of wet air. Exactly the conditions that had helped ruin the old herb business. The rain did not stop the next day. Or the day after that. By the third morning, the barn windows stayed gray from dawn until evening, and every time someone opened the door, damp summer air rolled inside. May stood beside the first active zone. Shouldn't we turn the fans higher? No. But the humidity, more speed won't create more drying capacity. Ella checked the marked edge sample. Then the center. Both were moving more slowly than they had during fair weather tests, but they were moving together. That mattered. The old version of Ella would have seen slow progress and tried to force it faster. Now she watched for imbalance instead. By the fourth rainy day, the first zone reached its target range. Ella and May cleared it completely before loading the next scheduled harvest. No half-finished herbs remained crowded behind new ones. No extra bundles filled convenient gaps. Ray watched them leave an entire rack section empty. You could fit more there. Yes. Ray gave a small nod. That was all. The second zone loaded only after the airflow path was clear. May followed Ella's chart without being asked. Load. Space. Check. Clear. Then move. The process looked slower than the packed barn had. But nothing backed up. On the fifth day, Tori called. I need to know whether I should replace your order. You should protect your business. That isn't an answer. The replacement batch is still moving. In this weather. Yes. Enough volume. That's what I won't promise until it passes. There was a pause. Call me when you know. May had heard enough. She's looking somewhere else. She should. And if she buys somewhere else, then we still finish this correctly. All this could work and we still lose the buyer. Yes. Ella hated the answer. But the barn could not be run by promises anymore. On the sixth day, the rain became heavier. Water streamed down the glass. Ella checked the newest active zone. The edge sample was not ready. The center sample was not ready either. But the difference remained small. No brittle outer herbs. No cool, trapped center. Ray stood beside her. How long? Longer than the first test batches. That bad? No. Ella pointed toward the chart. Slow isn't the same as uneven. For the first time, Ray smiled. Not because the shipment had passed. It had not. Because he finally understood what Ella was watching. The seventh morning arrived under the same low clouds. Ella entered before sunrise. The fans were still humming. The rack stood behind rain-covered windows, loaded with replacement herbs representing almost everything still salvageable from the later harvest. She began at the edge, one marked sample. In range, she moved to the center. This was the position that had betrayed the packed barn order. The place where moisture had remained hidden while the outside looked ready. Ella opened the bundle. No stale smell. No soft inner mass. She checked the sample. In range. She took another from the opposite side. Also in range. May entered quietly. Well, Ella held up one finger. Not yet. Rear position. In range. Another center check. Still good. Only then did Ella turn around. May searched her face. They match? Close enough. After this whole week? Yes. Ray appeared in the doorway. Ella did not celebrate. Not yet. She packed samples from the completed zones and called Tori. You can inspect. Tori arrived that afternoon while rain continued tapping the roof. She did not care that the barn smelled good. She did not care that the racks looked impressive. She went directly to the finished replacement lot. Ella showed her the marked center and edge samples. Tori opened bundles from different positions. One from an outer rack, one from the center, another from a later zone. No brittle edges, no damp centers. Tori looked at Ella. 7 days like this. Ella nodded toward the windows. 7. And you didn't add equipment. Same 2 fans. What changed? We stopped asking them to dry more crop than the airflow could carry. Tori checked one final bundle. Then she marked the replacement lot as passing preliminary acceptance. May exhaled. Ray gripped the edge of the work table. The redesign had survived the exact weather that once helped close the business. The old tobacco racks were no longer a theory. They had held dry herbs through a week of rain. But Tori had not yet accepted the full replacement shipment against the revised wholesale agreement. Passing the barn test was one thing. Meeting enough accepted saleable weight for the order and getting paid enough to reopen the shop was another. The replacement shipment left the farm the next morning. Ella watched the truck disappear past the wet field and felt less relief than she expected. The herbs had passed inside the barn. Tori's preliminary checks had passed. But the wholesale account depended on the final accepted weight after inspection and packing. Until that number was confirmed, the shop stayed closed. Ray kept the auction folder on the corner of the work table. He did not mention it. Neither did Ella. The rain finally weakened that afternoon. May opened the barn doors enough to let in brighter air and began cleaning the cleared rack sections. She stopped beside Ella's chart. Which zone do I load next? Ella looked up. May was already holding the spacing guide. A month earlier, she would have filled whatever rack looked empty. Now she was waiting for the sequence. Zone 2, only after the first one is cleared and checked. May nodded. No argument. She moved the hanging bars exactly where the chart showed. The system was no longer something Ella alone understood. It had become a way the barn could actually operate. Ray came in carrying the old wooden drying board that had once hung near the entrance. Most of the writing had faded. Crop names. Dates. Old batch notes from years when the business was busy enough that nobody imagined the shop could close. He set it on the table. Found this in storage. Ella ran her hand over the edge. I remember that. You used to write your name on it when you were little. May laughed. She wrote her name on everything. Then the phone rang. Ella froze. Tori. She answered immediately. I have the final inspection. Ella gripped the edge of the table. And the rejected center material from the first attempt is still rejected. I know. I'm saying that because I don't want any confusion about what I'm accepting. There isn't. The replacement shipment passed. Ella closed her eyes. Tori continued. The accepted weight meets the revised wholesale requirement. Ella opened them again. Meets it. Yes. Not everything Ella had once promised. Not the overloaded full barn volume that had failed, but enough properly dried, saleable herbs to fulfill the replacement agreement. Enough to be paid. Enough to keep the account. Tori said, I'm releasing payment. Ella looked toward the dark shop across the yard. That was the answer she had been waiting for. The herbs had not merely survived 7 rainy days. They had become saleable product. The old racks had produced enough accepted weight to turn back into revenue. Thank you, Ella said. Don't thank me. Tori's voice stayed practical. Send me what your system can actually handle next time. Ella smiled. That's the plan. When the call ended, May read the answer on her face. We passed. Ella nodded. The replacement requirement. May shouted once and wrapped both arms around her. Ray remained beside the table. Payment. Released? He looked through the open barn doors toward the shop. For several seconds, nobody said anything. The building had been closed because too much of what they grew became unsaleable before it reached a buyer. Now the first meaningful wholesale payment in months was coming from the same barn everyone had been ready to empty. They did not reopen the shop with a grand ceremony. There was too much work. May cleaned the counters. Ray restored the basic utilities they had shut down. Ella reviewed exactly how much future harvest the drying zones could support before they accepted another order. No guessing. No filling racks because space existed. No promises based on what the barn looked capable of holding. The wholesale payment covered the immediate costs of restarting operations and gave them enough reason to keep the equipment instead of selling it. Ray called the auction man. Ella heard only his side. No, a pause, not postponed. Another pause. Cancelled. He hung up. Then he picked up the equipment folder and dropped it into a drawer. The barn stays. Ella nodded. Ray looked at her. And you run it. Ella stopped. You own the farm. I know. I'm not asking you to give me the barn. I'm not giving it to you. He pointed toward the drying chart. I'm giving you authority over what goes through it. May leaned against the work table. So she gets to tell us when we can harvest. Ray looked at her. If you want saleable herbs, May pretended to consider it. Then she picked up the spacing guide. Fine. Ella laughed. Ray lifted the old drying board. He found a marker in the drawer. For years, the board had carried only the family farm name at the top. Ray wrote beneath it, Ella Grant Drying Operations. Ella stared at the words. You don't have to do that. Yes, Ray said, I do. He hung the board near the entrance. Not because Ella had saved everything alone. She had not. She had lost a major batch, overcommitted the system, spent money on a process that failed before it worked. But she had also stayed long enough to understand why. That mattered more. The next wholesale order was smaller than the one Ella had first accepted, deliberately smaller. They scheduled the harvest backward from the drying zones. May cut only what the next available section could handle. Each zone cleared before another heavy load entered. The two fans remained the same. The racks remained the same. What changed was how much Ella expected them to do at once. Weeks later, another rainy afternoon settled over the farm. Water streaked the barn windows. Inside, the tall tobacco racks held rows of evenly spaced herbs. No frantic crowding. No hidden center mass. The fans hummed at low speed while air moved steadily through the shallow zones. May checked the chart before bringing in the next harvest. Ray entered from the reopened shop carrying an order sheet. We have another request. Ella took it. How much? Ray told her. It was more than their current schedule could safely handle. Once, Ella would have looked at the empty rack bars and said yes. Now she checked the drying sequence first. We can do part of it. Ray nodded. And that's what I'll tell them. Ella looked through the rain-streaked windows at the old racks her family had once considered worthless. They had never needed to hold everything. They only needed to hold what the air could dry properly. Behind her, the drying board carried her name. In front of her, the herbs stayed dry while the rain kept falling.